first letter to the Corinthians.
Blessed be the God and Father of our chapter 1 and verse 3. Fight the good fight. Timothy chapter 6. And in our series on extraordinary psalms, we come to this psalm which deals with the terms of God's blessing. Now it begins on an extremely dismal note. In fact, the first 3 verses are dismal. And then suddenly it changes its tone, the psalm. And this has often been regarded as a mystery. Unnecessarily, I think, that it should start in this dismal way. O God, David says, thou hast cast us off. And naturally we ask the question, when did the people of God, the typical church of olden times, go through this terrible experience that is going to be described? Now, David was often in deep troubles himself because of hostility and opposition and so on that would crop up, but he speaks not just for himself, but for the whole nation. O God, thou hast cast us off. When, we ask, is this recorded in the history of the Old Testament of any time in David's reign? It isn't. There is no such time when the people as a whole were cast off during the course of David's reign, or for much of Solomon's. O God, thou hast cast us off, thou hast scattered us. Whenever, it's asked, could that have been? Thou hast been displeased. The displeasure of God was shown, which usually means the taking away of all divine tokens of his favour and his power. O turn thyself to us again. Now, it could be said that perhaps during the course of David's many battles against marauding pagan neighbours who would constantly come in and seek to overrun parts of the land and to plunder and to destroy, it might be thought that there is some unrecorded skirmish in which they suffered a very great setback, and that gave rise to these dismal words. Why have we been cast off? But there's no room for that in the history of David and in the record of 2 Samuel. An event like this. So, almost inevitably, those scholars down the ages who have doubted the true inspiration and infallibility of the Bible have decided, in their wisdom, that this is not a psalm of David at all, and that it belongs to a much later age when the experience described in the first 3 verses may have been had. And there were terrible troubles and so on. But there's no need to take a radical view like that and to doubt the word itself. It's in the style of David. It uses here and there language which David utilizes in other psalms. It's undoubtedly a Davidic psalm. But the explanation for the dismal opening is very simple and actually brings the whole psalm to life. David is speaking very much in the past tense, not of what was going on at the time he wrote the psalm. And indeed, this brings us to the inscription above the psalm, where we learn that the psalm was written at the time that Joab returned after the defeat of Edom. Now that's recorded in 2 Samuel and chapter 8. Actually, you learn a little more about it in this little inscription than you do in 2 Samuel chapter 8, because there it's not even specifically said that Joab was the general who took Edom. It simply indicated that there was victory over Edom. And we can assume that at some time during the various defences of the nation, Edom took advantage of David being away with his forces and came into the territory and began to plunder. And so the senior General Joab was detached to go and look after that situation. And he did. And we're told that there were 12,000 Edomite soldiers, no doubt, who were killed in that conflict. But in 2 Samuel chapter 8, we're only told of this as a victory, listed among all the others. So we know when this psalm was written. It was written at the time of 2 Samuel chapter 8, where there is the listing of all the victories over various surrounding pagan nations that constantly came in and attacked and so on. And it tells us most plainly in that psalm that from that time David was triumphant, acclaimed, accepted by mostly everybody. The land was united and his reign was successful. So clearly he's looking back on what used to be the case. And we read the first 3 verses. It's important to understand this in this light. O God, thou hast cast us off. When? Well, I'll tell you when. In the time of King Saul, of course. Do you know what this psalm is? It's a psalm of review. It becomes a psalm of thanksgiving and prayer, but it is essentially a psalm of review. It is David inspired by God to teach the people how it came about that the land became so successful, how it came about that it was delivered from all its enemies. Well, battles still went on, but they were always won. How it was that with dealing with enemies as they came in, nevertheless, they dwelt in peace and security and prosperity. And David is moved by the Spirit to remind the people it wasn't always like this. In the time of Saul, it was awful. In the time of Saul, everything failed. The divine favours were withdrawn. The protection of God was withdrawn. There was total insecurity and chaos and unhappiness. And he's calling upon the people, not boastfully, to think back and contrast all the troubles they had in the time of Saul with all the peace and prosperity and defence and protection they now enjoy and the blessings of God. And it was essential that he was moved to do that. Because if people move from a bad situation to a good one, they will soon get used to it and then take it for granted and then forget the troubles that brought about the earlier dismal situation that they've been saved from. And they may slip back into those troubles and they may fail to appreciate the principles and so on that keep them in God's favour and in happiness. So it is important that David said, look back then to Saul. Look at the disaster. Look now. Think what the difference is. This happened, this happened, this happened. Treasure these things. Hold on to these things. That actually is the essence of Psalm 60. That's why it starts so badly. Not because it's their present situation, but because it was their situation under the former king. Now, if David was himself entering into human boastfulness, there are no end of things he could have said, which give a lot of credit to him, but he doesn't mention any of those things. It's rather interesting. This isn't self-justification. This isn't the vaunting of the king. This isn't the king firmly establishing appreciation of himself, because all the things he points to are connected with the attitude of the people to God. You did think like that, and it brought trouble on you. Now God has changed everything. And we look at things like this. He only looks at the noble things. He omits even where he would have been entitled to take credit for things and say, now in the new kingdom, I do this for you, I do that. He doesn't mention anything like that. It's not self-satisfaction, it's not boasting, but he's pointing out some of the spiritual elements that led first to disaster and handled differently lead to great success. So look at the first 3 verses in this light, the dismal verses, first of all. O God, and let me insert, I hope you'll forgive me doing so, to keep it clear, let me insert, in the time of Saul. O God, in the time of Saul, thou hast cast us off, thou hast scattered us. By the way, this is the old way of looking at this psalm. This is what you'll read, say, in such as Calvin's commentary and the old writers. This was always the way of viewing this psalm. It's the only credible way. O God, thou hast cast us off, thou hast scattered us, thou hast been displeased. The displeasure of God implies serious sin among the people in their attitude to him. O turn thyself to us again. That was the cry of the people, or became their cry. Then verse 2, the picture of an earthquake is brought in to illustrate the terrible state the land had been in under King Saul. Thou hast made the earth to tremble, thou hast broken it, heal the breaches thereof, for it shaketh. Now, of course, in an earthquake, a land is almost ruined, or was years ago, often is now, but where structures were so lightly built and so on. Thou hast made the earth to tremble, the people were afraid and alarmed and insecure. Thou hast broken it, all their village reservoirs and so on were breached, and the water flowed out, and there were breaches thereof. There was no security, any walled cities. The walls fell, for it shaketh. This is all an illustration. This is how we were in the time of Saul. There was nothing secure, there was nothing certain, and the military was badly organized and all over the place, and the land knew poverty and difficulty, and God's goodness was withdrawn. Probably even a measure of crop failure and famine. Things were in a sorry state. And then verse 3, the last of the dismal verses describing the past, thou hast showed thy people hard things. Thou hast made us to drink the wine of astonishment. Now, many of the Hebraists are fairly sure that the wine of astonishment was a sort of poison. But even if it was only something highly intoxicating, the illustration means this. The people were just so foolish that this is what they supported and this is what they wanted. It was as though the people were judiciously blinded to the problems that had brought this predicament upon them. Well, David knew about that, and he could have complained about those things in this psalm, but he refrains from speaking about himself. You remember what happened after he was anointed by Samuel to be king? Well, he could not be king because he was persecuted by Saul, and the people of the land supported Saul in this. They would inform on David. People would turn against David, of all people. They had a wretched and a godless king who sought nothing but self-glory, made a total mess of all things, and the land was in desperate straits. And yet, here is the amazing thing. Wine of astonishment is a good term. They supported him. They wanted him. Here's Saul, head and shoulders in stature above everyone else. He is surely a king. He is a person to be admired. He has regal bearing. He is the man we support. We're blinded to the chaos and the confusion. We have heard, because it surely was heard, that another is anointed to be king. We don't want that. We support him. And it's Saul who has the crack troops and the people on his side. And he wastes so much time hounding David to death, so he hopes. And David could have complained about that, but he leaves it in these terms, speaking under inspiration, thou hast made us to drink the wine of astonishment. Mark you, there's an application to that today, because we live in an age of decline spiritually. and a decline even among the Bible-believing churches, who so often, fortunately not all, but so many, seem in these strange days to be doing all the worst things they could be doing, and all the wrong things, and they seem to have forsaken the right things. And we could say today, well, the testimony to Christ, evangelicalism, is truly broken. Evangelicalism in our land, generally speaking, is ineffective. It isn't winning souls. And where it appears to be winning souls, it's doing so by the wrong means. And those supposed converts, many of them, last only 5 minutes. And they're not secure because it's a superficial thing. And so, judged over 5 years or 10 years rather than a few weeks, the churches are not ultimately growing and things continue to go downhill. And yet, strangely, nobody questions it. The people are perfectly delighted. We love Saul. We want Saul. You could have said to them, but look what he's done to your nation. We want Saul. We love him. They're intoxicated. It's the wine of astonishment. Clever people have been almost judiciously blinded. And that's so today. The great experiments of today, the charismatic movement, and the havoc and chaos and ungodliness and confusion that it causes. And yet people continue, even good people, continue to support it, as though there's a sort of blinding. And the things that are done and taught and the practices followed are so often unbiblical and make no sense. But no, it continues. And then the whole contemporary Christian worship movement. Nothing could be more crazy and unproductive and against the work of Christ. And yet the people are delighted in it and support it. It's the wine of astonishment. Why is it? But this was happening in the reign of Saul in a different way. And yet, in God's goodness, there were people among them who feared the Lord. And finally, God moved and he changed the scene. And this change begins to be recorded in verse 4 of Psalm 60. Thou hast given a banner to them that fear thee. A banner, well now it's a military illustration, as though a banner which has such properties that when it's lifted aloft, a standard or flag at the head of an army defending the nation, is bound to secure victory. A banner is given to them which will prevail. If they follow this banner and lift it high, they will be successful. It's a figure, it's an illustration. Thou hast given a banner to them that fear thee. It turns out as you go on in the psalm, it's the banner of the word. It's the banner of God's promises and God's word. So suddenly, people like David himself and others in the land who have the truth, who are proclaiming that the land's gone wrong, that it's following unspiritual values, it isn't obedient to the word, it isn't worshipping, it isn't praying as it ought to be and calling upon God for help, it isn't trusting him, it's trusting King Saul and all his waywardness, it's going after the wrong things. Those people who lift up a banner calling the people back to a right way and to trust in the Lord, they're being heard. All of a sudden their voices are being heard and followed. Thou hast given a banner to them that fear thee. And it transforms the whole scene, that it may be displayed because of the truth, that thy beloved may be delivered, save with thy right hand, and hear me. So prayers for change are heard, and Israel begins to be transformed in its whole attitude and in its manner. And that's what we need in evangelicalism at large. I can remember going back here in South London, the time when there were evangelical churches everywhere. Just 50 years ago, not all were entirely healthy, but many were. You think of a place like Peckham. Peckham had 3 large, flourishing evangelical causes among the nonconformists in the Baptist community just 50 years ago. There aren't any that you could call healthy now, or large, or vibrant in a true sense. It's gone. Going across from Peckham and across into East Dulwich and so on, and Herne Hill, there were more. There were, we thought things were low, but by today's standards they were marvellous. There were, I can think of any number of well-attended, solid, evangelizing, evangelical churches. Where are they today? They've gone. There were just 1 or 2 left in parlous state, almost extinct, and this church was one of them, in a very poor shape and condition. The days of great congregations and glory had been broken by the war. And here, just 50 years ago and more, we were down to about 40, 50 people in the tabernacle. It was no longer viable. The auditors at the time said the church should close. So we were in a very poor state. But one grand thing about the tabernacle, it had gone wrong, you see. It hadn't left the truth. It always remained a Bible-proclaiming church. But it had rejoined the Baptist Union, and it trusted that. All its trust post-war was in the help of the big body and denominationalism and what it could do for it and things like that. And the trust had shifted to gimmicks came in and trivialization of the gospel, and the old ways were no longer honoured. The truth was still here, but the whole methodology had collapsed from the preaching of the word and earnest prayer and serving the Lord and good works among Christian people. All that had collapsed. It was gimmicks and associations that mattered, and it brought us as a church right down to our knees. And then it came to the point where the only people left, wonderfully, were those who loved the old ways, the fuddy-duddy ways, the old discarded standards that were no longer modern. Just a few elderly people who were saying to themselves, we want to go back to the old trust and the old methods. And the Lord gave them that and enabled them to have that. And the church put the clock back, and from that moment we would have people coming in affected by the word, saved, deepened, until today. Now I want to be very careful what I say, because we are a body of people who love Christ and seek to serve him. But make no mistake, we know we have many faults. We're a struggling people. We have many things we're constantly obliged to put right, so I don't want to sound complacent. But now the church is so much stronger, with record numbers of people post-war involved in Christian service, able to maintain the great Sunday school and youth outreach and things of this kind. But what's brought it about? Well, this 4th verse, thou hast given a banner to them that fear thee, that it may be displayed because of the truth. Just to return to the promises of God, to the methods of God, to the gospel preaching emphasis and the principles of the word of God, forgetting trust in man. And they, when David came to the throne, just think of some of the differences. They had to switch their hearts and their allegiance from the fine, upright King Saul, the king, every inch, the cut of a king, and all his celebrations and his self-esteem and his pomp and glory, to David, Who's King David? If he has a victory, what does he do? He comes back to the capital and goes straight into the house of God onto his knees and gives all the glory to God. We don't want a king like that, some would say. We want a celebrity king. We want a great figure that the nations around can fear and admire. We don't want a man who's always going on his knees to God, as though he's a nobody, as though he can do nothing without God. We don't want a man who's humble and dependent. I just illustrate one of the tremendous differences. They had to get used to the idea that one of the main reasons for admiring King David was that he was a man of God. And do you know what this man does in his spare time? He writes songs. He writes psalms. What does Saul do in his spare time? Well, I suppose he's a Henry VIII type of figure in his youth, who wins jousts and duels and parades and is glorious and so on. But David, he writes tender devotional songs of praise to God. But such was the work of God, the land switched its allegiance and its tastes and its appreciation. And it stood behind, or mostly, David had many people who rebelled against this within throughout his reign, but generally speaking, the people stood behind David as a man of God. What a difference. What a transformation. And God blessed that. And that's what we have to do as a church, not figureheads and gimmicks and devices of man. Look at one of the last verses of this psalm, Psalm 11, verse 11. Give us help from trouble, for vain is the help of man. And vain are the devices and inventions of man. And vain are all the things that are invented as gimmicks for churches to do, to give them surefire success. Says this verse, they won't work, any of them, because God insists on the preaching of the gospel and prayer and reliance on him and nothing else. So that's really what this psalm is doing. And I'm only trying to imitate it, where it draws attention to the great difference between the state of affairs under Saul and the state of affairs under David. And it magnificently does it without any self-credit taken by David. So that down in verse 5, that thy beloved, who's thy beloved? Well, it's the people. It starts off with a few that fear him. And with the work of God taking place, it soon becomes the people generally who have been promoted from a few fearing to many being loved by God. That thy beloved may be delivered. Save with thy right hand, we might say, with all thy mighty power, O God, and hear me. And the prayer is heard. Things have changed. Everything has changed. Now look what David does under inspiration in verse 6 as the psalm begins to take an even more elevated direction. God hath spoken in his holiness. And what follows is not a quotation. You won't see any references here, though there are some, but to direct quotations of any words of God. Because God is portrayed here rather than quoted as saying victorious things. I will rejoice in my people, that is, and have pleasure in them. I will divide Shechem and mete out the valley of Succoth. Well, Shechem and Succoth are great historic names in the land, and they're clearly taken here to represent between them all the land. But all the land is described in grandiose historic terms. I will divide them. And it seems to be a statement that says God will protect all the portions of the land that have been given to the tribes. Under Saul, that didn't happen. Under Saul, there was tremendous erosion of great areas of land by pagan marauders coming in and doing as they wished. Sometimes they get chased out, but not always. And nobody ever knew when they would come and create disturbance. And the statement of verse 6 appears to be David saying, God spoke to us. God made promises. Well, he did. You find them in the Old Testament. You find them in the book of Genesis. You find them in Numbers. You find them in Deuteronomy. The great statements of blessing of the tribes of Israel. But here it's put into different language. And probably David had statements from God through the Urim and the Thummim, through the high priest, outside the holy place. And God would say to him, I assure you, your efforts to defend the land will be victorious. So I will divide Shechem and mete out the valley of Succoth, probably refers to the integrity being maintained of the allotted lands to the tribes during David's reign. And then Gilead is mine, Manasseh, Ephraim and Judah. Well, Gilead and Manasseh were the lands east of Jordan, and Ephraim and Judah were the principal tribes west of Jordan. And that's very precious, because Ephraim was the largest of the tribes, and it was, I suppose, the major military muscle of Israel. Whereas from Judah came the line of David and the lawgivers. And it was only during the reign of David and much of Solomon that Ephraim and Judah worked in harmony. Harmony was now a characteristic of the land. Harmony is a characteristic of congregations when the Lord is with them, when the Lord is at work and he alone is trusted. So Ephraim, for the first time in their history, didn't mind being ruled by Judah. Wonderful. To Judah fell the task of government. To Ephraim fell the task of military defense, and they accepted it and were happy with it. That's the Lord who'd done that. It wasn't so under King Saul. And then the heathen nations that were among the leading hostiles in verse 8, Moab is my washpot. In other words, Moab, for all its pride, the famous pride of Moab, is going to be in service to Israel. Over Edom will I cast out my shoe, which appears to be a kind of term of contempt. And yet Edom had wonderful fortifications. And then a strange phrase, Philistia, an enemy, triumph thou because of me, which can only mean something like this, that Philistia, when her marauding bands are defeated and she's brought under the government of David, will actually rejoice and will breathe a sigh of relief and say, we never thought this would happen, but we're far, far happier under David than we ever were under our own kings. That must be the meaning of Philistia, triumph thou because of me. So it was a kindly rule. But these are statements of God. They're assurances to David and the land that they will defend successfully and triumphantly. And verse 9 seems to anticipate an objection or a question. Who will bring me into the strong city? Who will lead me into Edom, that garrisoned capital of Edom? Well, God has given great assurance. Verse 10, wilt not thou, O God, which hadst cast us off, and thou, God, past tense, which hadst cast us off in the reign of Saul, but not now, and thou, O God, which didst not go out with our armies. We have nothing to fear from the hostility of atheism, from all that's antagonistic to the gospel. Because if we are working in God's way and we're seeking to honour him, and we're looking not at human methods or human beings or even the spokesman of the gospel, but we're depending on God in prayer for blessing and success, then we will take people out of the kingdom of atheism. We will take people out of the jaws of the enemy and of Satan, and they'll be saved in ever greater numbers, just as they had great success in the typical church in those times. Verse 11, give us help from trouble, and we repeat, for vain is the help of man. Nearly all the books you can buy today on evangelism are cram full of human devices and ideas. Quite recently I was reading of a conference, I dare not tell you which one it was, among evangelical churches, because I don't know the absolute certainty of what I'm going to suggest to you, but anyway, the theme of the conference was something like communicating the gospel, I forget the precise title, in postmodern times. But I looked down at all the speakers, and as far as I'm aware, though all those speakers were evangelical men, none of them would be known as gospel preachers. None of them would have been people who were trying in their churches with regular evangelism, proclamation of the gospel, laying aside of contemporary nonsense and human gimmicks. All of them would have been up to their ears in all these things. And I thought to myself, how tragic and how sad this is. What's the point of getting ministers together and talking about communicating truth in postmodern times if you're just not doing any of the basic things? I'm thinking of Saul. I'm not suggesting those men are as bad as Saul. I'm not suggesting that they're not believers at all, or that they're secret sinners. I don't want to suggest anything about them and their lives. But there's a stark similarity in that Saul, well, he stood for not trusting the Lord and the ways of the Lord and the worship and the house of God, but human strength, and it failed him, and human devices and strategies, and they loved him. He was a carnal king, and even believers can be behaving in a carnal way, and we all the time, we like David, we must say sometimes, why is it that we didn't die with the other South London churches of 50 years ago? Why did we not continue to go down? Well, because we were blessed in that we got down to a remnant of people who wanted the old ways back, and they prayed for them to come back. And they did. And all the power of God is in the old ways and the methods of the word. And that's the thing I'm emphasizing this evening. It's a psalm of comparison. It's a psalm which calls us to look at the evidence. It's a psalm which reminds us to appreciate every ounce of blessing and what it has been based on, so that we never forget the things that take us down, and we never cease to appreciate the things that lift us up. Give us help from trouble, for vain is the help of man. And the last verse, through God we shall do valiantly, for he it is that shall tread down our enemies and draw people out of the clutches of the enemies of the gospel, even as we proclaim, teach children, knock doors, reach out to a community. The Lord will do it. That, I believe, is the message of Psalm 60, and the intention of David in moving from the dismal to the triumphant. Don't forget, it's a comparison of the reign of Saul with the reign of David.